Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I time travel back and revisit almost every live show I've ever seen from 1975 to the present. Hey there, everyone. This is Various Artists, your host here at the My Life in Concert podcast, and this is episode 4, coming to you recorded from London, Ontario, Canada, amid the global COVID lockdown. Hope you're doing the same and that you're all well and safe out there as we go through this tough time. And as we are indoors and may not be attending shows for a while, this is a good time to look back at some great shows from the past. As in this series, I try to recount I will recount almost every live show I've ever seen. And to start the series, I'm looking at one show from each of the 5 decades where I've been a concert goer. Episode 1 was the introduction. Episode 2 was my first show, Roxy Music, in 1975. For the 80s, it was the Ramones here in London, Ontario, with the Demics in 1980. And for the 90s, it is going to be an amazing festival and sort of a peak moment in the grunge era, the Lollapalooza 1992 festival, specifically their stop in Barrie, Ontario, Canada, about an hour north of Toronto. And this episode is called Flower, Lollapalooza 1992, with the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Ministry, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Lush. That's who I got to see at Molson Park, Barrie, Wednesday, August 5th, 1992, with Flower being the title of Soundgarden's 1988 single from the Ultra Mega OK album, and also indicative of what was happening in the culture and in my life at the time. Now, the podcast series is based on a blog that I wrote for many years and have now reactivated, mostly as a podcast, called MyLifeInConcert.com, and you can go there and read some of the old blog posts, and I'm putting the podcasts up there. Now, I never got to this one. This is further down the line. It's concert number 76. I'll be recounting my memories from that day, but not only do I have my memories of that day, I have an incredible trove of notes that I wrote throughout that day, which I'll be getting back to in a moment. The last show I looked at, the Ramones, that was in 1980. Well, we're now 12 years later in 1992. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of kind of where I was and went musically in those dozen years. Now, as I talked about at the time of the Ramones, basically punk, new wave, all the sort of things coming out of that genre or those genres, pretty much dominated my musical taste at the end of the 70s, early 80s. Especially in the early 80s, it kind of all exploded into a kaleidoscope of options, varieties, subgenres. You had post-punk, you had electropop, you had new pop, then you also kind of had the indie stuff and the jangle pop and sort of all of those different flavors and varieties that had sort of come about from that cycle that began in the mid-70s. Well, that had kind of played itself out in many ways by the mid-80s. And when I think of especially the rock music I was listening to in the 80s, rock and pop music I was listening to in the 80s, I always think the first half is dominated by Britain. Now, there was also what was happening in the New York scene as well with sort of avant dance music and hip-hop. That was a big part of the early 80s too. And that also influenced what was happening in the UK. And the second half is dominated by America, and increasingly from all Canadian bands I was listening to. But I always think of a lot of the British stuff in the first half of the decade, and the second half, very much the whole Amerindy scene, sort of post-hardcore scene that had come around, was one of my key things, like Husker Du, The Replacements, Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr., etc., etc. That was sort of the key rock music I was listening to. However, what I really remember about this time is while I kept going forward and discovering new things, and that's always going to be a thing for me, I always want to hear something new that's happening. Well, I'd also listened to a lot of music from the past, but I really consciously started going backwards as well. during this period, and that's something that increased as the decade went on. There's a number of different reasons for that. I mean, one of the things was at the beginning of the decade, I got a cassette deck. So all of a sudden I could buy tapes and I could tape a wider variety of music and more kinds of music. Also here in London, Ontario, CHRW from the University of Western Ontario, the campus station went live first on cable and then completely publicly in 81. I cannot even begin to estimate how much of an impact that station coming on made on my taste, because first off, for the first time in my life, I was listening to a radio station that played the music that I liked and actually listened to, because especially that late 70s, early 80s, that was probably the biggest disconnect between what I was listening to and what was on the charts. But even more so is that you had a lot of DJs on there. They were older. They'd listened to a whole pile of music. And there was many other different types of music that I learned about through the station, especially jazz, which I hadn't really listened to a lot. And that made a big, big impact on me through the station. But even before that, especially in the early 80s, and post-punk was really a big thing for this, where it was more not four on the floor, but more of a funky rhythm. I got back into a lot of R&B and funk. And then it sort of went from there. But then there was also with the jangle pop, got back into sort of the folk rock from the 60s and that kind of sound. And then I started going back into more like full-on folk music, acoustic music, Americana, country music, a lot of different types of roots music. So, and also, too, the big thing, of course, midway through the decade, the CD revolution, CDs coming around, which meant within a few years, everything got reissued. You went from a period at the beginning of the 80s where a lot of older recordings were really, really tough to get. Within about a decade, that changed radically and also opened up what you were now able to hear. So when I think of myself in the 80s, I think of things going very much forward with a lot of loud rock music and various other forms of music, but also going further and further back and absorbing many, many different types of music. And while I'd always listened to a variety of types of music, at the start of the 80s, rock music was pretty much the sun in my solar system, with all the other genres as planets revolving around it. By the end of the 80s, music was more like one big buffet table featuring a series of bowls. And while there were many more bowls to choose from, and rock music was probably one of the biggest bowls on the table, it still was a more democratized approach. I listened to a variety of different things. It wasn't just that it was rock music and other stuff. Now, however, as I said, rock was still one of the biggest bowls on that table. And alt and indie rock was a passion of mine. I actually became a DJ on CHRW from 1984 to 1992, ending just a few weeks after this show to focus on grad studies. And it's really hard to remember how obscure and how out of the mainstream and how shiny and glossy the mainstream was in the 80s, especially in the second half when this really kind of blew up. You know, in the mainstream of the music industry, I mean, it was all hair metal and that kind of cheesy rock and really bad cheesy pop. It was just kind of like today, only maybe today's even worse. But as the decade was turning and we were moving into the 90s, there were signs afoot that things were at least shifting. Jane's Addiction in particular, who did Nothing Shocking in 1988. And again, that kind of got a lot of press, but it wasn't a big chart hit, but it was a seller over time. And when Ritual de lo Habitual came out in the summer of 1990, boom, that actually, I think, charted in the top 30, top 40, which at that time was unusual for a band like that. And it's like, okay. And that's the beginning of the SoundScan era. And that was like, wow, okay, this did better. They were also one of the first bands to incorporate elements of heavy metal into their sound, you know, sort of to help the arty-ass weirdness go down, as it were. And then, of course, there was also REM's unexpectedly popular Out of Time. Now, they had been rising in the latter part of the 90s, latter part of the 80s, but then truly exploded in the early 90s with the Out of Time album debuting a more diverse and experimental sound. And then, of course, the surprise success of Lollapalooza 91, which had started as sort of a goodbye tour for Jane's Addiction and also featuring Susie, Living Colour, Nine Inch Nails, Ice-T and Body Count, Butthole Surfers, and Rollins Band. And that was sort of a novel idea of this traveling festival of alternative acts who, on their own, would have a limited audience, but with all the audiences amalgamated, could create this festival as well as this whole idea of reimagining the festival, as it were. And it did far better than anyone had anticipated, which meant, of course, there was a follow-up in 1992. As an example of the type of thinking that was really prevalent at the time, I'm going to offer up a few stories that really stick in my mind. And they're both from the summer of 1990. And I worked at a record store, and I was having a conversation with somebody there who I will, as you know, I'm using pseudonyms for people. I will call him M. First there was the alphabet letter, then the Fritz Lang movie, and now there is the character in my series. So anyway, M and I were in the store, and we had just gotten in a Quicksilver Messenger Service box set. And it was in that time when the box sets were really taking off. But most of the box sets that were coming out at that time, that's before everyone and their grandmother had one, which is fine. But the ones that were coming out at the time, it was usually very prestigious acts, either in terms of sales or critical acclaim or that kind of thing. And I like Quicksilver Messenger Service, and I love all the hippie music as well. I'm talking about punk, but in my childhood, all that was around, so I love all that as well. And I love so many of the great San Francisco bands at the time. And I do like them, but they never really kind of did it for me, and I kind of thought they were sort of like, B-list sort of thing. And I think I was saying to M that I thought the Quicksilver Messenger Service box set on that day was a little bit egregious. And also, let's just face it, I was just being a prat. But anyway, this happened right around the same time that Sonic Youth came out with Goo, their major label debut. And as you will find out through the series, I'm a massive Sonic Youth fan. Have seen them many times. They'll be coming up in the series many times. There's going to be a bit of a Kim Gordon interview that I did, the whole thing. So anyway, and Goo had come out, and I was really excited and really getting into it. So I was complaining about this, and M was sort of saying, Sonic Youth and Goo, you're talking about the Quicksilver Messenger Service box set. 20 years from now, no one's even going to know who Sonic Youth is. And I remember, this is burned into my mind, especially as the last Sonic Youth album, unfortunately the last one, in 2009, before breaking up, The Eternal, finally went top 20 in the U.S. So apparently that was not the case, that no one would know who Sonic Youth was 20 years from now. And then I was going on, criticizing some of the, bland corporate pap of the day. I can't remember what it was. It could have been Martika or Jive Bunny or, Nelson or whatever. Quicksilver Messenger Service, at least good, and, they're memorable. Now, we have a bar here in town. It's still here, called The Office on York. It's one of the main alternative venues for upcoming alternative bands play, but particularly back then on the day, a lot of bands used to play here. As this series goes on, there's going to be a lot of shows I'll be talking about that took place there. And in the store, we had a calendar for Call the Office and a board of, bands that were playing. And there was this big poster up, like handbill, for a local band at the time called the Droogs, who were going to be, playing a couple of nights later at Call the Office. And so I was going on about, whatever, Jive Bunny or Martika or whatever. And M came back with, see, these guys, they may be packing Call the Office, these guys here, but that's it. They're never going to go beyond that. At least, Jive Bunny, look at all the sales that it's making, it's selling. These guys are never going to go anywhere. And this was burned into my mind because this was the thinking at the time. And with that band, they actually ended up changing their name to the Gand Harvest shortly after that, and then had a national hit in Canada in 1994 with The First Day of Spring. I think at one point it was like they played it every 10th video on Much Music. So yeah, smug is rarely a good look, but sometimes you just got to own it. And again, the reason I bring this up is not to make any fun at M, who I genuinely like. and I run into every now and then. It's to show that was the way of thinking, is that there is this big commercial entity and anything outside of this would never break through. And of course, as we know what happened with Nirvana and then in the 90s on Lollapalooza. But at the time, this was the way of thinking. And it seemed any deviation from this was unthinkable in any large context. It's true, nothing truly left field had hit widely over on this side of the Atlantic. Nothing really raw. In a variety of senses that was really like raw, edgy, to become wildly popular on this side of the Atlantic through most of the 70s and the 80s. And then, boom, Nirvana broke huge in late 1991. And no one, I can tell you, no one saw it coming, least of all, M. Sorry, M. And it was the long overdue floodgates that had sort of happened in Britain and parts of Europe with punk in the late 70s. Well, 14 years later, it's delayed. It finally hit this side, or the version of that aesthetic hit this side of the Atlantic in late 91. And it was fast. I remember the first time hearing about them, I was on air at CHRW in September of 91, and somebody just phoned up and requested Smells Like Teen Spirit, and I had it on. It's like, oh, this is okay. And then a couple of months later at the store, we're shipping it out of the store almost in boxes. It was just a very, very big shock to many, especially those established in the music industry who would never envision something like this happening. And the whole thing was truly hitting mania fever pitch by the summer of 1992 when this second Lollapalooza festival happened. And it was becoming clear that this wasn't just a one-off fluke with Nirvana, but there had been a true changing of the guard, and there was a big aesthetic change that was going to be there for at least a few years. Now, one thing about this period, it's one of the few times in my life where there were simultaneous upheavals in my private life and the larger culture around me, and both were pretty fucking great. Along with this explosion in a lot of the indie music I've been listening to, it kind of happened all around, an explosion in indie alternative culture, film, writing. New and different subversive ideas jumped out of the shadows and into the mainstream. And so, in this context, I attended my first festival in 9 years. I hadn't been to a festival in 9 years. The previous one was the Police Picnic, 1983 at C&E Stadium, which is concert number 19 in the blog series. And a lot had changed in those 9 years, and for the better, especially in the mainstream of the rock world. There's still a lot of sexist, homophobic, racist shit that was part of that mainstream culture. And it was part of the hippie era, liberating in some ways, but there still was a lot of chauvinism in these ideas that were there. And they, in time, with sort of classic rock, largely morphed into this suburban homogeneity. And with this new alternative aesthetic that emerged, even if not perfect, there was all sorts of problems still, I see. But there really was a sense that things had changed. And there was a sense that I felt of inclusionism and a turn away from the really kind of more stupid impulses of sort of like the knucklehead rock end of the spectrum. And this was a huge advance and made this world a whole lot more appealing to me. I acutely felt this wave of alternative culture blowing up in the mainstream, twinned with my own flowering revelation, connecting a lot of inner dots in my life, figuring myself out, and then finally coming out of the closet as gay in 1992. It was a massive boulder of relief off my shoulder. And as I was saying, my tastes were pretty diverse at this time, but, I really did have a passion for, rock music and, the alt-rock music. And the rock world in general and at large was, especially then, not overly enlightened on a number of fronts. And those unenlightenments just got deeper the more you got into the mainstream of corporatized rock and corporatized music. Lollapalooza, going to this festival, having come out, all this happening, this day and festival embodied the positive, the changing of the culture. It embodied a lot of progressive feelings at the time that people were growing up, and finally changing. This simply felt different to me than it had before, and far more welcoming. So this intersection of a public and private busting out meant that it was a really happy time for me after a crappy time. We were sort of shredding all the prudishness from the 80s, and I was just shedding a lot of dead emotional weight. I remember this gig with a lot of fondness for that reason, and I kind of see Lollapalooza as a microcosm or metaphor for the whole thing that was happening. For myself, the world around me, everything was starting to flower after a dark period. It was a period of a lot of positive change. It was really great to be there and be alive, and it's good to remember and think of these times at a dark time now, is that things go in cycles, and while things are dark now, let's hope for a more positive day ahead. We were also very, very buzzed for the whole day, me in particular, which added its own magic. But first, we'll backtrack. Now, as I mentioned, for people I'm talking about through the series, I'm going to be using pseudonyms, and I went to this gig with two people who will be showing up many times in the series, and we will call them MZ and MP. And all of them having done big gigs before, we were all sort of veterans. MP was living in London at the time, which I was living in, and MZ was in Toronto, and we drove up from London to Toronto the night before, crashing at MZ's apartment. And we got up the next day and were greeted with blue skies and sunshine. And this is another thing you really have to understand. 1992, that was the first summer I can remember of weird weather. Here in southwestern Ontario, it was pretty standard with the seasons. You know, winter would start to end at the end of March. You know, we'd get Easter in spring. Summer would start, hot, humid summers, and we'd have the fall. Everything pretty much went to plan. There was deviations, but generally it was fairly regular. And 1992 was the first year where it was freezing. We essentially did not have a summer. I remember going over to my mother's place because I'd go to my parents every Sunday for dinner, and it was in July, and I went there. It was 7 degrees outside, 7 degrees Celsius. I was inside. The heat was on. My mother had a sweater on. She said, "I've made a lovely roast beef dinner for today." And I said, "Look, you're not helping," because usually be more summer fare. I'd have to go back and see the statistics, but it sticks in my head. It was something like there was only like 12 days in the summer when it went above 20 degrees Celsius. So when we woke up on that morning and it was blue skies, it was going to be warm, it was going to be clear, it literally felt like we'd won the lottery. Now, we breakfast at Fran's on College Street before packing into MP's vehicle for the hourish drive out of the city on the 401 up to Barrie. Now, here I need to interject that when I was picking this episode, I knew that I had a journal entry. I was keeping a journal through the late 80s, early 90s. When this series hits that period in particular, I'm going to be able to give you some really detailed takes on shows because I was taking a lot of notes, also too from the 2010s onward. But this is the one period from my past, roughly starting in 86, going to about 95, but primarily 88 to about 92, 93, where I have a lot of detailed entries about all the things in my life. But in particular, I have a number, well, at least in particular for this series, I have a lot of great descriptions and details about shows. Now, I picked this concert in particular because I thought it would be an interesting marquee name that would interest people, but also I knew that I'd kept journals, and I knew when we moved into our new place last year that the journals are here, I'll find them, and I'll have these notes just written on the page. And so I found the journal, found the one from where Lollapalooza would be, and started reading, and it was basically, well, Lollapalooza was amazing, and I've included my notes on the other page. And I'm like, what? And I look over and realize that I'd totally forgotten about this. Just as we were leaving for the show, I decided to just grab a notepad and some pens, and I ended up taking real-time notes over the course of the day. I almost started weeping when I found these. This was amazing, and there's just so much in there, fun little details, things I would never have remembered, in jokes, which I won't necessarily go into because they're not going to mean anything. But what I'm going to be doing through the rest of the podcast, at various times I'm going to be reading from the notes I took that day. Also, on the My Life in Concert website, I have posted clips from some of these notes for you to see and read. So I'm going to look at some earlier posts in my journal that sort of mark the Lollapalooza journey. The first mention I have is Tuesday, June 9th, which starts with I got a great postcard from special guests today. Well, that's the name I'm using. And special guest was, of course, part of episode 3 on the Ramones and will be upcoming. So funny that it's mentioned here. I just finished a big letter to him last week that I'm mailing this week. So his correspondence was timely. And I say later on, MP dropped by early this afternoon. She just bought a journal that she's starting, and she gave me my Lollapalooza money. I guess, because I was going to be picking up the tickets. I'm going with MZ and her, and it should be fun. Skip ahead to Friday, June 12th, and got Lollapalooza tickets yesterday. So there we go. I'd claimed them by the 11th. Oh, and once again, special guests phoned me from England late on Friday, and we had a great chat. We divvied up the charges, but it's still going to cost me. Remember when, long distance was so prohibitive? And finally, on Sunday, June 19th, it says, going to Lollapalooza with MP and MZ, both of whom are quite depressed. So it was kind of that period. I was coming out of one. It was just kind of an intense period. And in fact, at the bottom says all three of us were talking and saying right now is very much a time of change. But it's all pretty exciting. Years ago, I wrote that I thought something big was on the horizon. Well, the horizon is here, I'm happy to say. I'll also throw this in. I was just talking about the weather. August 1st, August has begun, and it's fucking freezing outside. It feels like it's about 8 degrees. It's rainy and cold, and I officially give up on the weather this summer. So again, to have a great day like we had, it was like magic. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the notes, the notepad that I wrote over the course of the day. And I said after breakfast at Fran's, we got in the car, and the first note is from noon. Apparently, we were listening to CFTO to see if there was any news about Lollapalooza or anything before we put the tunes on in the car. It says no mention as of noon, although I distinctly remember there being a commercial coming on. I forget where it was in Toronto, but they had Scott Thompson as Buddy Noble, and we all got a big chuckle out of that. Next up is at 1:30, it says, stuck in a traffic jam on Avenue, so dense we have to turn around. That, of course, would be Avenue Road in Toronto, making our way out of the city. And also blaring Soundgarden on one of the nicest days of the entire summer. And I vividly remember, as I always do with my brain that I have, the tunes from that day. I vividly remember before leaving in the apartment, we were listening to Holes, Pretty on the Inside, and then Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger. And I always remember listening to that other grunge classic on the way, Humble Pie, Rockin' the Fillmore. And I remember coming home, the trip back to London we had on Octung Baby U2. Then it goes on to read 20 minutes later, hit another jam on the Gardener at 1:44 p.m., and it's 24 degrees. Flip over the page for third traffic jam at 2:10-ish p.m. on the exit to Barrie. MZ has a nasty cold. So anyway, here I was returning to the scene of my very first festival, the legendary Heatwave Festival from August of 1980. And by the way, it's the 40th anniversary of the festival this year. We'll not only be doing a podcast on this, I have a few things sort of planned for the 40th anniversary. And you can read my post on the mylifeinconcert.com blog. And the music at Heatwave was incredible. And the Talking Head set, where they debuted the material that ended up on Remain in Light for the first time ever, is one of the best, if not the best set I've ever seen anyone play. And once again, on this day, I returned to the same place to witness a series of superb apocryphal sets. We got there early afternoon, wanting to do the pre-gig parking lot boogie thing and get our shine on nice and bright before heading in. It's party time. Not only did we have lots of weed pre-rolled and cans of beer for the walk from the lot to the show, we'd also brought along something of the fungi variety that MP and I were initially planning on splitting. Pretty much once we got there, it was party time, and I started getting, well, we'd already started getting our shine on back at the apartment. So I was already a sunshine Superman shining brightly upon arrival. Now, not too long after we got through the gate, MP and I were going to split the fungi. And she realized that even though it was the start of the day, it was going to go on. When you do something like that, probably, and especially with all the other partying, she had to drive home. It just was not feasible for her to be doing this irresponsible. And so she said, I'm not going to have these. Would you like them? Now, normally with that sort of thing, I wasn't usually too excessive. I mean, there was a lot. I mean, in this series, there's going to be a lot of partying, especially in the 80s and early 90s, because it was the time and younger, and people in that world, that's kind of what it's about. But I never usually, well, not often, didn't super overdo things, but it was Lollapalooza. The culture was changing. I'd come out. It was a gorgeous day. It was just an amazing experience. And so I thought the word of the day is going to be excess. And it was. And what a day it was. Turning back to my notes, it says at 3:10, teens in a field moshing to Metallica. Well, that's what I wrote. Says, everyone still parties in the parking lot, but I couldn't hear Led Zeppelin 4 playing anywhere. And of course, I love Led Zeppelin. We had Humble Pie on earlier, but it was, again, we needed something new. Jane's Addiction are now the norm for parking lot music, and crowd isn't quite as young as I would have expected, which is really funny. Now I'm 57. This was back in 92. And even then, I guess I was getting to be an old un, but I mean, that's changed a lot because I now go to festivals and it's all ranges, all ages. A lot has changed, and a lot's changed for the better. As for the site, it says it's well set out. The stages are at either end, and there's the sort of various stuff in the middle. I also recorded our initial impressions of the festival and what was going on. It says here, MP says, it's like a gathering of slightly like-minded people. And MZ saying it's not really an aggressive crowd. I don't really see any aggressive, dangerous types here. Well, maybe not aside from the front of the mosh pit. Also, veggies are really zinging now. Anyway, so we were walking around the village, taking it all in, then, but of course we headed over for the music. Now, the main stage lineup was, in order, Lush, Pearl Jam, the Jesus and Mary Chain, Soundgarden, Ice Cube, Ministry, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I can't remember. Now, they had the second stage, which was kind of a unique thing, and now that's very common at a lot of festivals. And I can't remember most of the acts who were going to be playing there. The one I do remember that we wanted to see, and it was the very zeitgeisty of that time, Jim Rose Circus, who were coming out of that high shock value aesthetic that had been a midnight movie preserved with Pink Flamingos and Eraserhead, among others, which I enjoyed and approved of. But we didn't get to see the Jim Rose Circus. My guess is that it conflicted with a main stage act we wanted to see. And of the 7 main stage acts, we saw 5 of them: Lush, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Ministry, and Red Hot Chili Peppers. Now, when we arrived, Lush were on stage mid-set. They were noisily all right. They weren't bad. The shoegazer thing, I don't mind it, but it's not really a huge thing for me. I liked a bit of Ride, did My Bloody Valentine, but it's kind of more take and leave. And they weren't bad. What I remember most from the set was guitarist Mickey Bereni's flaming red hair, just like Mink Stole as Connie Marble in Pink Flamingos. So, once Lush were done, Pearl Jam were up next and were far more memorable. Now, at the time this tour was booked in the spring of 92, they were a little-known entity about to release their debut, and from the Seattle scene where Nirvana had just broken. With the eyes of the music world staring down on Seattle in Nirvana's wake, the grunge with the classic rock crunch of Pearl Jam blew up almost overnight, meaning that by the time this tour got underway, they were possibly the most anticipated band of the day. And the performance was incredible, spurred on and luxuriating in their ascending stardom. It's always such a blast to see a band who's just breaking wide. You can see them up there riding on all that giddy energy. Now, my take on Pearl Jam in general is I actually have a lot of respect for them, the way they've handled their career and their fans. And so I have a lot of respect for them, but the tunes, I'm kind of so-so on. It's just a little too much of the sort of a hint of the Bon Jovi. Well, that's kind of really not my thing. And I wouldn't necessarily put them in that camp, but they've kind of got a bit of that sort of larger than life element that, well, it depends on how it's done, but generally I'm not all that huge a fan. However, on this day, they really, really impressed me. And there are some songs I like for instance, Alive. That was the first song I heard by them right when the album came out, because I was working in the record store, and that song blew me away, and I still love that song. But a lot of the others, it's more like than love, but they were just on fire during the set. And again, everyone was there to see them. It was kind of like that falling in love moment between artist and audience. And Eddie Vedder in particular was a really incredible frontman. And at one point he got so into the performance that he ended up climbing the scaffolding to the top of the stage, which also was a little, don't fall. So the band's going away. He walks across the scaffolding and then successfully and safely climbs down the other side. But it was a little tense for a moment because it's like, be careful up there. But that's kind of the mood for the day. Everyone was just letting go, and there was just this sense of freedom and excitement. So my notes from the day say Pearl Jam came on at 5 and the beer tent vacated. The day could not be more perfect, hot and sunny with a cool breeze. The sun feels like a massage. Then I say, Pearl Jam, this is a quote from Eddie Vedder, "This is more intense than we're used to. They were tight and heavy. I say they're less cloying live." Another quote, Eddie Vedder said, "If any Americans come up, be sure to do your drugs here. It's a better place." And lead singer from Pearl Jam, in an adrenaline rush, scaled the scaffolding to the top, walked across and came back down the other side and said, "You only live once, so live. It's a long day, so take care of each other." So following Pearl Jam, we decided to take a booze and village break and skip the Jesus and Mary Chain and Ice Cube. Now, I'd never been much of an Ice Cube fan. With the Jesus and Mary Chain, if this had been 6 or 7 years earlier, I would have been speaking in tongues. I had been so obsessed with Psycho Candy, their debut album, which I still love, and that early string of singles. And I was less excited by the material that followed, and so I'd sort of lost interest. And I regret not seeing them on this day. It would have been good to see them, but oh well, we didn't. Instead, we spent more time taking in the village. In my notes from that period when we were doing the walk around, the first thing I say is being relatively older at these things gives you a greater anonymity. This is good. It allows you to be as deviant as you like quietly. Again, older. What a laugh. I would have been 29. Good crivens. Also here, MZ, it's also laid back. Also, I put down, I must have smelled this Tiger Balm and patchouli. Now, there's a throwback. And also, I'm zinging hard. It also said, it's not that everybody is dressed really extremely. It's just that you know that you're not at a Bryan Adams concert, and that is a good thing. And MP added, everyone is altered in some form or another. Sort of my takeaway from that day was, there was a lot of people there that had felt marginalized in some way or another, and everyone had had enough crap from others. We didn't need to give it and get it from each other. That may sound corny, but it really did feel like a place of freedom and acceptance. The pie head quotient seemed pretty absent. And also just the idea of the village, that was pretty fascinating to walk around seeing all these, liberal progressive ideas and organizations go mainstream after so many years of repression in the 80s, that whole unshackling. The one thing that did perplex all of us was the tattoo and piercing tent. Not that I have anything against those things, but literally, you're going to get it done in this highly unhygienic Lollapalooza. And we kind of had a laugh about that, and I later found out someone I knew did get one, and hey, guess what? It got infected. But hey, this is all about living and learning and trying new things. Now, after spending some time in the village, we dashed back for the act that definitely MZ and I most wanted to see that day, in particular, Soundgarden. We'd been obsessive fans for a few years, and now we're dying to see them live. Now, Soundgarden were one of the first bands that I got into from that whole Seattle scene. I can remember the first time hearing about what was going on there. Because, of course, when punk broke in the 70s and early 80s, in America, there was New York, there was L.A., San Francisco, of course. Minneapolis had been a big city. Athens was another one. But especially being out here in southern Ontario and more eastward, I don't really recall hearing much of anything coming from that area of Seattle. It's not really. I knew that Seattle had that history. Of course, there was the garage bands, there was the Sonics, and of course, Jimi Hendrix, most famous of all. A little bit later, Heart came out of Seattle. That was another big name. But I hadn't really heard, I wasn't really thinking of it as a rock center. And in the 80s, I think the Young Fresh Fellows were from Seattle, and I kind of knew of them, but I didn't really know a lot was happening. And then in the fall of 1987, I was at CHRW from 84 to 92. And the station manager at that time, can't remember the gentleman's name, sorry about that. Whoever you are, if you're listening, you're also one of the very best station managers the station had. And he'd gone on a vacation to that area, and he came back and he said, Seattle is amazing. You would not believe it there. There's all these bands and all these clubs, and everyone's going out, and there's this whole new sound that's coming from there. And he was raving about it. And I'm like, Seattle? Really? Interesting. But he said, yeah, and I brought a bunch of records back. He said, but this band in particular really blew me away. And he handed me an album, and it was The Screaming Trees, Even If and Especially When. I played the first track off at Transfiguration, and it was, oh yeah, right away. So I was starting to take notice of the releases that were coming in from that part of the U.S., and it grew and grew, and of course exploded in the early 90s. Now, Soundgarden, I think it was shortly after that, about a year later, because Ultra Mega OK came out, and we got that at the station, and a 12-inch of Flower, the single, and I used to play those on my show a lot and like them. But it was the next album on A&M, Louder Than Love, that I got a play copy because I was doing music reviews with a local magazine. And that album just blew me away. I'd been listening to, with the grunge stuff, and well, it wasn't called grunge then, it was alternative rock, indie. But I also, particularly in the later 80s, it's the one time there was a lot more heavier and aspects of heavy metal of what I was listening to. Certainly I liked the Metallica from that period. And Jane's Addiction and Soundgarden seemed to be these bands that mixed elements of indie rock and alternative rock with some of the aspects of heavy metal that I liked. And Louder Than Love just blew me away. It's one of those albums I played a million times. And so I was primed for Bad Motorfinger when it came out in the fall of 91, in a really horrible time in my life. That's when things really went crappy, and they didn't get sunny until the spring of 92. And I don't know, there was something about the dark heaviness of that album that just sort of got me through that time. It was very cathartic music. There were high expectations for this set, and they did not disappoint. They were absolutely amazing, super heavy, super focused, just incredible. Now, on my notes, I was writing down the set list. I don't know if this is complete. It doesn't seem like it. What I have is Face Pollution, Gun, Holy Water, Drawing Flies, Cop Killer. They did their own version. It says, talked about Wea issuing Cop Killer, and the crowd went nuts. They did Rusty Cage, and then Hey Jude, which segued into Jesus Christ Pose. And my commentary here is a set of pulverizing, convincing hard rock. They are the best hard rock band of now, the Led Zeppelin of the 90s, and this is good. Now, the one thing I didn't write down here, but I have a very clear memory of from this set, and I could have sworn they were doing Gods and Bulldozers at the time. Of course, this is when the fungi, along with all the greenery and the alcohol, really kind of was hitting a peak. And with that stuff, there's always these, sort of ideas of, I'm going to be floating around the room. And it's like, and that doesn't really happen, except at this gig during this set. At one point, I could have sworn it felt like I had left ground. Like, not like in sort of, a like a 50s sci-fi thing where I've got a jetpack on and I'm flying through the cosmos. Not like that. It was more like, say, a foot off the ground, and everyone kind of just seemed to be really intense. And yeah, it was about a foot off the ground for a while. I felt like I was just kind of floating on the waves and the music. And yeah, it was a day. Now, of course, Soundgarden went on to explode with their next album, Super Unknown, which may be the best album And then, of course, fell into a bit of decline when sort of the grunge thing ended in the later part of the 90s, but then had a solo career. And then Soundgarden came back, and actually I saw a little bit of them in the early part of last decade when they were headlining Ottawa Blues Fest one night. But actually, I really wanted to see Bootsy Collins that night, and I had seen Soundgarden, and Bootsy Collins did end up headbutting me that night, so it was a special evening, and there's also video proof of that somewhere. But we did see the intro. And I'd hoped to see them again, but of course, very sadly, Chris Cornell committed suicide a few years back. A big, big tragedy, always very sad, and he left way too young. However, I'm glad that the band had a chance to reform and play for a new audience. But I know that on this day, that show that I saw at Lollapalooza, the ground-leaving show, was absolutely superb. Killer live band. Back to my notes, after the set ended, it says they're playing the new Sonic Youth Dirty following Soundgarden. Apparently MP has hiccups. And the next page it says MP as Beanshoe, Beanshoe at 8:30 p.m. Oh, I think she'd spilled some chili beans on her shoe or something. And it looks like she grabbed the notepad and it says, because this is my writing, "We're lost in the supermarket. Why do we have to wait so long in line?" I don't know. Now, following Soundgarden, which musically I thought was the highlight of the day, came Ministry, which just in terms of pure experience, this was the bludgeoning highlight of the day. Now, I hadn't really followed Ministry closely, and I hadn't really been into a lot of the industrial rock bits of it. I like the original stuff with Throbbing Gristle, and I probably liked more of that a bit after, but at that time I hadn't really been listening to Ministry. I knew that they started off as this sort of electro-pop band in the mid-'80s, but they had formed into this much sort of harder, denser, darker groove that I later enjoyed, kind of went back to, but I still didn't know a whole lot of stuff. They had just released their brand new album, I think like a week or two before, Psalm 69, and that was really the highlight of the show, and good crivens, it was fun and intense. My notes say, Ministry, heaviest fucking thing I've ever heard. Minimalist and hypnotic. Jackhammer rhythms with an array of guitars and 3 dancers. I remember that. They had these female, quote-unquote, dancers on stage, sort of kitted out in leather, but these bones, but it was kind of, you know, the camera would come up to them, and it would be like a big, like, what the hell are you looking at, buddy? So sort of, they sort of went with the theme of Ministry and being up there. And I remember Al Jorgensen having this kind of large scooter made of bones and riding it around on the stage. Aside from that, I also remember Mickey Bereni from Lush coming back out with her red hair in the evening. When they did Hero, that's the one tune that in particular really stands out for me. And also there was this kind of tall college jock who was standing next to MP. And I remember him asking her if she wanted to get on his shoulders so that she could see the stage, as she's shorter, and she did. So she had a great vantage point for a few numbers. After Ministry, it was time for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Somewhere in between Ministry, or maybe during Ministry, but somewhere in there between Ministry and the Red Hot Chili Peppers, MZ and I got separated from MP. So you're in the midst of thousands of people, and this is all before cell phones and all that. And we're like, okay, how are we going to find this person? If not, we'll meet back at the car. And one of the things, too, we decided to go up a little bit closer for Red Hot Chili Peppers, but it was almost like being sucked into a vacuum as everyone was going closer and closer, and then the show started, and people were just going nuts. And we realized we are getting sucked in closer, and what would happen is people would go to the stage, they'd be moshing, flying through the air, and then they would just literally grab them out of the crowd and take them. We thought, we're going to go over that barrier, which at 29 or 30, I didn't want to do that just then. So I remember sort of putting my head down like I was a football player and just charging through the field with everyone sort of following behind me until we got into an area where we had a little bit more room. And amazingly, we ran back into MP. That's absolutely incredible that we did it in this crowd, but amazingly, we did it. Now, as for the Red Hot Chili Peppers themselves, I found it kind of an anticlimax. Here's the thing. I like the Chili Peppers, and there's a number of tunes that I like. Later on, Danny California. I used to love the Mother's Milk album. Actually, I like One Hot Minute, which none of their fans seem to like, or they seem to be that into. It's just got Dave Navarro on it. But I just felt it was like an anticlimax, and the set was a little flat. A lot of noodling. It just didn't seem to have the takeoff. And I saw the Chili Peppers in 2016 again, and I love some of their tunes, but live they just don't work for me. I had the same feeling. They were good, but it was just sort of a come down after Ministry and Soundgarden. In my notes, what have I got here? Chili's ended with Crosstown Traffic, Blood Sugar Sex Magic, and Party on Your Pussy. Flea said, George Bush sucks the juice from my asshole. They did If You Have to Ask. They opened with Give It Away. They did Higher Ground. Also, this I remember, Flea doing a solo version of The Needle and the Damage Done, just him and his bass, and also he played the set in his underwear. So that was it, the end of an incredible day. And of course, what tops off a long day like that? Getting the hell out of there and getting home, which is never easy. And it was particularly challenging on this night. The next entry says, now we've got to rest and then hit the highway. It is going to take hours. The 401 is down to one lane. Now, for those of you non-regional, the 401 is a major stretch of highway. I believe it's one of the busiest stretches of highway in all of North America. And to have that, and night and day, it doesn't matter. It's busy. To have that down to one lane as an entire festival exits, that is the definition of poor planning. And I do remember it was so jammed trying to get out of there. We just sat in the car and rested for a while, and then we started, but it just took forever. And in fact, on the last page of my notes, I write 4 a.m. traffic jam down to one lane. Then we must have got out of there and got to McDonald's, and it says the McDonald's staff is squirrely. MP asked, busy night? And the employee said it was worse than July 1st, which is Canada Day, for those of you who don't know that. I don't think we actually made it back to Toronto till almost dawn. And then I got back into London in the afternoon and went right to work at the record store. That Lollapalooza show in Barrie was truly an amazing day of music, an amazing day that summer and in my life. And even when I got back to work the next day, M, who we talked about earlier, and another person from the store was there. And even he was sort of saying, we were looking at the top 30 wall in the store. And what was on the top 30 wall? Red Hot Chili Peppers, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Ministry. All these bands that had broken and that were huge for $30. You even had to concede this was, a hell of a deal. Sadly, unfortunately, not only was M probably unhappy to see the Sonic Youth and all these noisy bands getting somewhere, but I believe he told me that his son went on to buy Ministry Psalm 69 and set his morning alarm clock to go off to it. So, pity him. This era launched a period of a few years that were so fertile and interesting in North American music and pop culture. And indeed, in this series, Lollapalooza's 93, 94, and 95 will all be coming up down the line, but I feel this one was the absolute best. Well, this wraps up my look at Lollapalooza 1992. Please check out the mylifeinconcert.com website. I'll have ephemera from the day, some of my notes, the original ticket, etc., etc. And remember to like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and also check out some of our videos, and can also listen to the podcast over at VATV, our YouTube channel. Just a reminder that this introductory series, where I'm looking at one concert from each decade, continues, and coming up next, episode 5, will be Never Get Old, David Bowie with the Polyphonic Spree, the Corel Centre, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, Friday, April 2nd, 2004, concert number 104. Sadly, the last of 5 times I got to see David Bowie, but musically probably the best show of the 5. Then, podcast episode 6, Leonard Cohen, I'm Your Man. Also, it's at Scotiabank Place. That place changes its name every 5 minutes. Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, December 7th, 2012. I'm your host, Various Artists, and thanks for stopping by and listening to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast series. Tune in next time to episode 5 with David Bowie for Lucky Mistakes, Desert Island Tunes, and being relatively up close and personal. Everyone take care of yourself out there. Bye for now.